I'm now going to hand over to our first presenter this evening, Dr. Julianne Vickers, who's the Access Archivist at Explore York Libraries and Archives. Julianne's been involved with this project since its inception and will tell you a bit about why we embarked on the development of this tool before handing over to the team from Bright White. Hi, Julianne.
Hi, thanks, Wendy. And thank you to our wonderful Festival of Ideas audience as well. I understand that quite a few of you are joining us from York, but we've got many people coming from further afield as well. So thank you for joining us. As Wendy said in her introduction, I'm one of the archivists here at Explore, where we look after and make accessible the amazing archive collections in our care. Tonight, I really just want to give you a brief background to the situation that we found ourselves in before we embarked on this project. In essence, I suppose I really want to frame the problem for you before handing over to Bright White, who are going to frame the response that we came up with to that problem. For those of you unfamiliar with the archive here at Explore, we hold the records of the City of York Council and their predecessor bodies, alongside many local business archives, community archives, and archives of individuals within the city. Our civic collections are really particularly significant and constitute one of the most important local authority archives outside of London. York became self-governing in 1212, so we have over 800 years of civic archives recording life in this amazing city. And of course, being custodians of these incredible collections meant that at least until March 2020, we had a similarly wide-ranging and busy engagement program. And I'm going to share a picture with you now, which is just to remind you of life before March 2020, really. So this is what we used to do in the archive. We used to have people, lots of people, interacting with each other in our buildings, directly with the archives, or experiencing the archives in other ways, such as through events, workshops, tutorials, and visits. And of course, this was an engagement landscape that we took utterly and completely for granted. And it was, of course, an engagement landscape that completely changed in March 2020. I love this picture that I've got up here. It's actually drawn by one of the wonderful artists that we work with here at Explore. And I think it really sums up the situation that we all found ourselves in March 2020, when all the onslaught of news about coronavirus started hitting us through TVs and the various devices that we use. So suddenly, we found ourselves as archivists, but left without an archive. And I can tell you it was not something that we had ever received training for. Our users were unable to access the material in our collections, and the world began interacting online. And I'm willing to put my hand up and say in December 2019, I had no idea what Zoom was. That changed pretty quickly, actually. Overnight, really, our jobs were transformed, and we needed to reach out to our communities in different ways, and that reaching out really needed to take place online. But when we looked at the digital content and the platforms that we had available, it suddenly seemed a bit inadequate. What had seemed fine a matter of months ago suddenly just wasn't quite doing the job for us. We had content, and we put more content on platforms such as YouTube, Flickr, and our blog. But the new world was really demanding something different. So why were these traditional platforms falling a bit short in the lockdown world? Well, for a start, they're really dependent on us creating content for specific audiences on specific subjects and specific themes. And that needs to be done over and over again. And needless to say, that's quite time consuming. YouTube, Flickr, and other platforms are brilliant, at what they do, but they are not designed with archives in mind. And what we have had to do is fit content into their template for communication. So what was missing? Well, for a start, the ability to explore the context and interconnectivity of archives online was missing. The ability for users to direct their own engagement according to their own interests was missing, rather than us having to predetermine or pre-guess what people might be interested in. But really most problematic for us was the way that the traditional online platforms really force archives, force us to present archives in isolation from each other. So you can have Flickr images and a Flickr gallery, but what you're missing are the complex relationships between those records. It also seemed to us that we were missing a bit of a trick. We had at our disposal digitized images and lots of descriptive information about those digitized images. And these are digitized images of archives. And what we really wanted to think about is how we could harness all of that data to create something that would meet the engagement needs of a variety of users with different interests, but in one communication tool. So brilliant, great. We had an idea, but unfortunately developing ideas cost money. And this is where, fortunately, the National Archives stepped in. And as part of their response to the pandemic, they made available new funding, appropriately enough called the Archives Testbed Fund, which was really aimed at innovation and experimentation within archives. The fund really aims to promote new approaches and to allow archivists and other professionals in the sector to push the boundaries of what they do. And importantly, one of the big priorities for this fund was to encourage partnership working. And that's when we thought, well, hang on a minute, don't we have an amazing tech company working literally just 2 minutes around the corner from us in York? And that's, I won't say too much about Bright White actually, because they will be talking a lot about themselves in a minute. But what I will say is we have been wanting to work with Bright White for many years, and we're really just looking for the right program or right project to entice them to work with us. Fortunately, this testbed project was enough to interest them, and we got together, hammered out some ideas and came up with the proposal for developing the prototype online storytelling tool using digital object data. We submitted our application to the National Archives, and of course we were successful, otherwise we wouldn't be here tonight. And TNA awarded us £6,000 to develop that prototype storytelling tool. So why was our application successful? Well, I have to really hand it to Bright White because they encouraged us to think big and think bold. And at the foundation of our project proposal for this storytelling tool was metadata. Now, for the uninitiated, metadata is data about data. So there are lots of different types of metadata, but just to give you an example, the online descriptions about our archives constitute a form of metadata. Why is it so important? Well, for one, it facilitates data reuse and data sharing. It enables data sets designed for one purpose to be used for another purpose. And it also counters data entropy and degradation, meaning that the original data stays useful for much longer. So that is why I quite like this little sign. That is why metadata is indeed a love note to the future, because by utilizing the inherent power of metadata, we were ensuring our tool would be flexible, adaptable, and enduring. And this would not be the case if we just created a platform, fed in a stream of digital images and didn't associate it with the metadata about those digital images. Another area in which Bright White encouraged us to really push the boundaries was the way that we as archivists describe the collections in our care. Now, currently we catalogue collections using an international standard known as ISADG. I won't bore you with what's behind that acronym, but the structural model for that standard is actually to the left of your screen now, and you can see it's a hierarchical tree. At the top of that tree, you can see the word fonds. That really just is another word for collection. So you could imagine this was perhaps the York City Rowing Club. Well, that would be the top description sitting at the top level of the tree, and all the records within that collection are sitting beneath that. And that is how we organize information in our collections. Importantly, how we organize information about our collections and make it available is also impacts on how you find information about our collections. And really, it's one of the drawbacks of the current way of doing things, is that records are isolated from each other because of this tree structure and the hierarchical approach to description that we're currently using. Archivists have really attempted to counter this effect by various means, but it hasn't always been successful. It's only really been met with partial success. The International Council on Archives recognize this, have long recognized this, in fact, and are currently in the process of working on a new international standard known as Records in Context. And the model for that standard is to the right of your screen, and you can see the difference immediately. Records in Context is a new holistic standard that will enable us to create what is known as semantic data. So that is data that is understandable to both machines and to humans. I don't have time to go into all the theoretical underpinnings of records in context tonight, but I think it's needless to say that you can see the difference already between the two systems of description. But one of the most important things about records in context is that it tries to capture the complex web of relationship between records, no matter where they are within collections and whether they are located in different collections. It's also flexible and adaptable, and there's really unlimited potential for growth in mapping descriptions of archives as well. So with metadata informing the development of our storytelling tool, we also decided to use records in context for mapping that data to show what could be achieved as a new standard for our sector, really. And that's where we're being truly innovative. Now, records in context is actually still in development. It's advanced enough for us to use for our project. But what we're really wanting to do is to showcase what could be possible in the future when this standard actually becomes the norm for the profession. So that's where we found ourselves, and that's what we decided to do. I'm going to hand over to Chris Walker from Bright White now. He's going to tell you a little bit about the development of the storytelling tool.
Thank you, Julianne. I'll just share my screen. Hello, everybody. I'm Chris Walker from the design consultancy Bright White Ltd, and it's a real honour to be able to present this project to you, the delegates today at the 2021 York Festival of Ideas, alongside Julianne Vickers from York Explore and my colleague at Bright White, Andy Nye. At Bright White, what we do is we help individuals and communities to tell their story. And that sounds simple, but the range of different media and technology and techniques that we need to cover to be able to do that and tell stories in the 21st century is massive and growing. And it includes developing non-linear and data-driven storytelling, something which is rapidly gaining relevance for archives. And on this slide here, just an example of the different kinds of people and communities and projects that try and show the spectrum. Really, we've just completed a project where you can meet and ask questions to the American musician Nile Rodgers in VR. We are just about in July. We're going to launch a new exhibit at the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford, part of the Science Museum group, using artificial intelligence and holograms to tell stories about really hard to interpret objects, in this case a BBC microphone, the AXBT. And we're currently assisting the National Centre for Children's Books and the Children's Laureate on a new exhibition, which is a really eclectic and really fun and exciting mix of different techniques, including digital puppets based on performance capture and relay, and it's crazy and brilliant. Also a major development project for Cheshire Archives and local studies as well. We love archives. We were very happy and very keen to get involved with Julianne and Explore because of this unique place that archives holds in our psyche. It is our community memory bank going back hundreds of years, and as such is a really rich source for storytelling and authenticity. But just to step back a moment, well, why did we really kind of see a appeal in this prototype project? And that's to do with storytelling. That's what we do. We help tell stories. If you think about what stories do or what makes a story, they do many things, and there are many things go together to make a story. And I don't want this list to be seen as a kind of you know, the full range, but certainly one thing that stories do is they connect things together. And this word "things" is going to come up more and more. It's actually, it strictly is a technical term now, things. And stories connect together people and places and times and events and actions and organizations. And then there are loads of different layers that you put on top. So stories connect things together. And if we just go back to my first paragraph, which maybe you may have sensed I was reading from notes, I've highlighted this first paragraph with all the entities and events and actions and organizations and people mentioned in it, just to give you an idea of how these how common these entities are in any kind of sentence or paragraph that we use it's a very short and dull story, this one particularly, but it'll give you a good idea how it's possible to look at a sentence or an utterance and work out within that sentence or utterance what the entities are, or actions, or organizations. And then if you look at the words that aren't highlighted, on the whole, they are the words which relate one thing to another. So I present alongside Julianne Vickers. Julianne Vickers is from York Explore, and in a moment you're going to hear from my colleague Andy Nye. Andy is going to demonstrate to you now the prototype. We're just going to dive straight into it, and how the act of connecting things together with data helps us to see stories and therefore tell stories. In this case, the data set you're going to see relates to the Hungate area here in York, and we'll explain why in a moment later, but I'd like to just hand over to Andy Nye, please.
Thanks very much, Chris. Very happy to be here with everyone. Thanks for attending. I'm just going to share my screen. And so this will make sense very soon. It looks a little bit like it's a color blindness test, but it's something a little more interesting and exciting. One of the first things we had to consider when thinking about telling stories with data is, where is that data? What does it look like? What's its structure? And how do we access that? So we spend quite a lot of time looking at where that data is. Obviously, it's in typically other databases, because we're talking about archives, digital archive storage. We had to see, what did we have to do? How do we transform that data, access it, and get it into a shape that would be compatible with records in context? As we've sort of gone through that journey of finding out where those sort of silos are and how to work with them, we've come up with various workflows for transforming that data and doing what we call ingestion. So we're aggregating data that sits in other databases. We're not replacing anything, we're literally aggregating and bringing those records together in a similar way to a search engine would. We're not replacing, we're just allowing a different type of indexing. So when we're looking at typical ways of storing data, it's normally in a database, it's normally very much like a spreadsheet. It's a matrix, it's quite flat, not typically quite very relational. So it is very much, it's human readable, but you have to pour through a lot of records. So that would look very similar to this, where we have each point here is data. It's a thing, what records in context calls things. The things that we're most interested in this graph here is people, places, and events. Now down here we have events where we can't currently see a connection. The connections will be there, but the data set that we're using hasn't established that yet. So this is very much what you see in a traditional data structure. It's very neat, it's very tidy, but that's not what life is like, and it's certainly not what stories are like. So if we look at this, every single dot is a person, a place, and an event that has been identified by bringing in records from the archives that Julianne and the team have transformed into this new records in context compatible format. And it allows us to actually have this constellation of different points that we can then see the complexity starts to evolve as we're looking at this. We can see where there's a density of these connections. So by zooming into that, we can actually then see what might be a story, where are the connections, where's the complexity in the data. It's worth stepping back a little bit to look at how records in context is typically used. It's typically used in something called a document model, where you can share in a single document all the data points that are relevant to a specific archive object, collection, or record part. So it normally, you wouldn't have to hunt anywhere else for anything relevant to that archive item. You have everything. We decided to implement records in context slightly differently and actually use a relational database. So we're extracting all of those entities within those documents and making them easier to connect. So they all stand alone. So each person, each place, each event has its own entry in our database. So we can quickly hop between those. We can establish those connections and do what we call surfing of the data. So jumping from one thing to another within that data set. So if I zoom into this, you can see here's a particular sort of dense collection of data, and it's all centering around this one node in the middle here. So we have a job title of laborer, and then we have 4 people who shared that job title in the period that we're looking at in our vertical slice. So we can see that there are family connections that have been brought in from poor law records. You can see that there's smallpox vaccination and Hungate clearance from the data sets that are relevant to that. And we can see that there's a trend that's really developed here. We can see the places that those people were, so we know that this is quite localized. So there's something there that we can see there's an interesting pattern developing, but then with this tool, we can also say, well, what's establishing these connections? So we'll be able to click on these items and actually see the records that have established that link. So rather than just being an interesting collection of dots, we can drill down into that data that's given us that supporting, you know, there are facts underlying those connections. It's not just a pretty graph. Part of the way that we've been able to expand the data is by creating tools that leverage human insight. So the skills of Julianne and the other archivists have been brought to bear in that transformation, adding additional data, adding that metadata in where it might not have been present before, detailed transcriptions to create something that we can make computer readable, so we can establish these things with a high degree of veracity. We've also connected machine learning. So anywhere where there's a large amount of text that's quite difficult to process, we've been running that through a Microsoft machine learning process called named entity recognition. So that helps us to determine in a block of descriptive text what's a person, what's a place, what's an event, down to quite a high level of confidence and detail. It's worth pointing out that here we're looking at hard context. These are connections we know to be true. They're very much family relationships and events connected to people. If we were to change this graph, if we were to map these things across a different context, for example, if we were to make this a geographical distribution, so we could look at this on a map and see these points, these same data points distributed on a map, we could see the story of a street, of neighbors, of communities, and view the data in that context and see those softer connections. These people are connected because they're neighbors. We don't necessarily have events that tie those people together, but the fact that they share a community absolutely does. What we found in the course of this project is that there are multiple silos for data. These things are stored in very different places, and there are a lot of what we would call authority sources. Things like open data sources, for things like births, deaths, marriages, and census information that can be brought in. So all of these points where if there is any uncertainty about who, for example, Benjamin Fletcher was, we could bring in those additional sources of data and overlay them and start finding where we see correlation from multiple different data sources. And any of these particular connected molecules could become enormous with those additional data sources. And that's where we think the real potential is with this. So in terms of the user experience, we've been looking a lot at what are called generous interfaces. Generous interface is one that presents you with as much as it thinks you need and a little more. So rather than potentially a limited selection of search results from a quite specific query, you're able to put in rather more sort of broad terms, let's say a geographical location, a date range, or a topic. And the generous interface will bring back to you potentially more than you need, but then allow you to filter that down to make it more relevant to the search that you had in mind in the first instance. So it can show you connected data. Similar in a way to things like Amazon. People who shopped for this bought this item, or this item typically is purchased with this other item. We've been looking at two separate systems here. One is the actual what's called an application protocol interface, the system that makes this search possible, that makes it possible to query this data in the way that we're doing. And the second is presentation layers. And we're looking to make it as easy as possible to add. For example, this is one presentation layer. This is one visualization. There could be any number of other potential visualizations or apps or websites that can tap into this data and portray whatever they would like. A really exciting example that we've been looking at is you could be telling a story. You could be delivering a piece of prose, and this system could be analyzing every word of what you're saying. And behind you, as a dynamic background, items from the archive, photographs and records will be brought to the foreground, brought into clarity as you're giving this performance as a really sort of dynamic and responsive way of sort of showcasing the importance of archive and the importance of storytelling. In terms of how we share knowledge, I think it's very important to say that this is not something that we're sort of putting a fence around. We're not interested in developing this as a piece of software that's our sort of proprietary tool. We're taking very much a public domain approach. There will be repositories where you can download this code, contribute, if you like, and it's very much the aim to reach out not just to other technologists to have them work with this tool, but to reach out into other areas. So people who are already telling stories and help to empower them using data to tell stories, to create artworks, and sort of see what other people from different spheres do with this sort of generous interface and this type of technology. I think I'm just going to pan around and zoom into this just to sort of demonstrate sort of the power of this kind of network structure. As we're sort of moving through here, it looks quite chaotic, but you start to see that there are these relationships. If you view this through a slightly different lens, you can see that we can have this type of structure where it looks far more, you can see almost like a typical family tree. We can see these connections in a much more regimented order, but we can actually map out and see exactly where things start to get interesting and where our connections start to be more rich. You can picture with additional data sources overlaid, these strands could get quite long and quite fascinating, that you could draw a circle around any of these, and that would be the start of an incredible story based on real events. And I'm going to hand back to Chris now, and who's going to say some more about the project.
Thank you, Andy. Just to say there, whilst that slide's on screen, now the color coding for this is, can you just talk us through the color coding, just so people can... Yes.
So pink is events, blue is people, and yellow is place, with grey being occupation. So that will make, if I go back to this, you can see then if you are interested in the people, you can see exactly what that distribution is. And it's also worth pointing out as well, wherever there is a digital instantiation, we can zoom down into that and actually see, so we'll be able to maximize those in the same way as we can with records as well. So anything that is visually rich or audio, music can be triggered in the same way. So this can be quite a rich sort of multimedia experience.
Thank you, Andy. Just going to take back control. So yeah, just a couple of bits in summary there. Talked about digital archive objects and what they are, and just I think three key aspects of digital archive object. It's a virtualization, so that's something like a scan or a recording of a tangible physical object, a photograph or a document or a record. The metadata that goes with that, and that is quite a large and growing list of metadata. So it might be a transcription. If somebody's speaking, it might be a written description written by either somebody contemporary, maybe the author themselves, maybe the archivist, comments, catalog entry info, and as Andy hinted at there before, one really exciting avenue for this is how machine learning is very well placed to be able to expand usable, highly usable metadata at very low human cost. Today, that's a practicable process today. But really importantly, digital archive objects, also the context is how does this thing relate to other things, whether that's part of a package or whether it's the author of that or different people who might be mentioned. Each of those new connections is very, very valuable, especially when you're trying to tell stories using an archive. So how does it differ to previous practice? Everything there in the database is defined as a data object with a very specific type, like a person or an organization, as is every relationship. So just to be clear, every relationship is specific. This belongs to this, or this was written by such and such person. Some new digitization took place by Julianne and her team for this prototype, and the previous parent-child data format has been transformed into this document model format, which opens up new possibilities for data processing. But critically, the archive is full of records that tie people and places and events together, but the way that digital records are kept, it's not straightforward to make those connections to other records. And the new format makes connecting things together very much easier. Connections appear automatically that were very long-winded to make manually before. So what does it mean for storytelling? It means that for any given entity in that visualization, all the connections to every other record, direct or indirect, are available immediately, which makes for much richer and easier storytelling. And as Andy mentioned, hand in hand with a generous interface. A blank screen is anathema to us. There's always a chance that something which is not central to your line of inquiry or search is still interesting. So always showing more than you think that the user is expecting. And what kind of stories could be told as a result of this project? And processing the entire archive in this way would be a big task. That's an understatement. And any new idea has to be piloted so that the costs can be weighed against the benefits. So this pilot project, we were looking for a limited set, a data set, and we call that a vertical slice to be able to demonstrate all aspects of an idea without needing to go full scale. And Julianne and her team suggested Hungate, and Hungate's absolutely perfect because it can speak to two audiences at the same time. You've got the new residents of Hungate who have either moved to York or relocated within York, and they're undergoing a kind of placemaking process as the new Hungate, if you like, starts to sort of gain its identity and discover its identity. The street layouts aren't exactly the same. So there's some interesting kind of geographical explorations there that we are looking forward to testing with present day residents in the new Hungate developments. But also actually quite a lot is known about where the residents of Hungate went to because of the slum clearances. We know where in York a large number of those people went. So that's really interesting there. We've got a kind of a diaspora out of Hungate to Town Hall. So we're actively looking to engage with audiences in Town Hall area who maybe take a different approach to this data and these stories, following familial connections back in time and exploring their heritage. There might be some surnames in the data that you've just had a glimpse of there that you recognise as York people, obviously of different generations. So where next? And this is a prototype. It's still very much in development. We're certainly not short of ideas of how it could be applied. And I'm just going to hand back over to Julianne, who's going to talk a little bit more about the future of this approach.
Great, thanks very much for that, Chris. Right, we've got quite a few ideas about where to go next. I think it's going to be narrowing down those ideas. It's going to be the tough bit. First of all, Andy has already spoken to you about the generous interface that we want to develop, and obviously that's going to be top of our list, and that will really allow users to explore content, the content that is behind all that data, either online or what they're calling a blended environment now. And we have always, when we had this idea for this tool, it wasn't just about what we can do during lockdown. We always thought we needed a tool that would be flexible enough to be of use in the new normal, the blended environment that we're finding ourselves in at the moment. Once we develop that user interface, then we're really want to make sure that it contains multiple access points for users as well. So people will be able to search by place, by person, by subject, by theme, by event. There's a possibility for using this with geolocation as well. So that's going to be a key part of the user interface. As part of the development of the tool, we are going to test and evaluate with key audiences in Hungate and Town Hall. And that's a really important part of the process, because we want that user feedback and to create this tool in an iterative way based on that user feedback. It's not just us thinking, oh, this is a great thing, and then pushing it out to users. We want users to be part of the development process. And then it's about exploring diverse applications, which, as I've already hinted at, are many. And Chris and Andy have already mentioned a few. We're looking at getting creative artists to use the tool, to incorporate it and embed it within performances. Geolocation software could be used, so you could use the tool as you're walking around the city, so the tool becomes immersed in the physical environment of the city. And also things like supporting teaching and research. We're finding it increasingly hard to get school students into the archive. Well, this would be a fantastic tool to use in a classroom environment. So that's just a few. There are probably many more, and that's the beauty of this project, because because we've got this foundation of rich metadata. What we can do with that is pretty limitless. Is there anything else you'd like to say about next steps, Chris and Andy?
Only that every time we look at it, it seems to be there are more and more opportunities. I know Andy's already mentioned the idea of a kind of live performance tool, and we'd really like to see what happens when people are given an opportunity to kind of surf through this and find their own stories and use that in really interesting and creative ways. It is worth saying that every time we add a new data source to this, the connections and the number of connections within that sort of constellation really massively increases. And you know, we've got some good news today from a new data source that we can tap into. Yeah, and you know, being able to move through different paradigms as well. So maybe looking at things on a map and being able to highlight a particular entity and then say, well, where does that fit in time? And then switch to a chronological view, and then maybe see that with that same entity, where does that fit thematically? Being able to switch around, and as Andy was saying, the underlying data remains the same, but the style of presentation can be changed in real time, keeping that kind of hinging around that entity. So you're exploring in different dimensions, and it's just super exciting.
I think an interesting thing that we were talking about with this is user-friendly. When I talk about ingestion and data, I think a lot of people glaze over. So I think it's important to have as one of the next steps to make this really accessible. It'd be great to have this as a tool you can just have on your desktop. You have a source of data, you can run it through a little wizard that will actually tell you how to make that data into a rich metadata format, and see what people can do with it from that perspective as well. Really broaden that out.
Thanks to the panelists, Julianne, Chris and Andy, and we look forward to watching the project develop and hearing more from you as it develops a bit more. Thank you to Dave for tech support, and thank you to everybody here for coming. Good night.